This is BBC Radio 4, and now it's time for the Queen's composer. Andrew Green talks to Andrew Gant about his role in Her Majesty's Chapel Royal and the long and intimate relationship between music and the monarchy.
When Henry V went to France in 1415 to fight and defeat the French, he took his Chapel Royal with him. The choir went with him and sang Mass on the battlefield before battle was joined. In the last scene of Shakespeare's play, the king declares, "Let non nobis and Te Deum be sung." Shakespeare knew the Chapel Royal Choir. He would have known that they went there, and they would have sung it.
Well, that was the voice of Andrew Gant, who is the current Queen's composer, or to put it more officially, the organist, choirmaster and composer to Her Majesty's Chapels Royal. It's a bit of a mouthful, Andrew. Already there we've got the picture of the Chapel Royal as, if we use a modern term, peripatetic, travelling with the king, and that was perfectly normal.
Yes, the Chapel Royal is a body of people, of clergy and musicians, whose role was, and indeed still is, to minister to the spiritual needs of the sovereign, wherever he or she may happen to be. And certainly in Tudor times, this meant travelling around the country, and indeed around Europe, wherever the king or queen wanted to go. And that survives to a certain extent today. My choir goes with Her Majesty the Queen to the Royal Maundy service every year, which takes place in one of the cathedrals in the country. We were in Canterbury this year, and last year in Westminster Abbey. And indeed on other occasions too. For example, we went with Her Majesty to the funeral of Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother at Westminster Abbey, and we will be at St Paul's for the national service of Thanksgiving for the Golden Jubilee.
Well, I think it's time to pop into the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace.
Well, we've emerged onto the top of the ranking of scaffolding here in the Chapel Royal's headquarters. And we're on the top level here, underneath the panels of the Holbein ceiling, painted in 1540. And it was painted to commemorate the marriage of Henry VIII to Anne of Cleves.
Well, I'm with David Baldwin, who's Sergeant of the Vestry of Her Majesty's Chapel Royal. He's also the author of the official history. But the extraordinary thing is the sight at the moment of this scaffolding just filling the chapel, which in fact is really very intimate. That's what surprised me when I came in. And in a sense, David, the Chapel Royal here represents not the end of the wanderings of the Chapel Royal, but a landmark nonetheless.
Well, yes, that's absolutely correct. Henry VIII decided there were rather too many people following him. So the Eltham Palace ordinances decreed in 1526 that really half of the individuals concerned should stay put in what would be becoming very fast the standing palaces with which we are so familiar up and down the Thames. Today we retain Hampton Court and the Tower of London as daughter establishments, and the chaplains of them retain a ranking within the ancient body here as deputy priests in ordinary.
How much further back can we go in the history of the Chapel Royal? What are its genuine origins?
There was a lot of argument over this, but we regard our founder as Caraticus, who returned from Rome in AD 58.
It's a bit ambitious, isn't it, David?
Well, it is, except he was the first Christian that we know to be in the royal court. But I would say that King Sigbert of the East Angles in 633 or so is the foundation of our first choral establishment. Sadly, most of that's beneath the sea. It's all washed away out at Dunwich in East Anglia. But that is really our first choir school.
Bar Robin by William Cornish, which sounds, Andrew Gant, very much like a secular song. Is that right? What's it doing in connection with the Chapel Royal?
That's right, it is a secular song. Cornish was the master of the children here at the Chapel Royal during the first half of Henry VIII's reign. Cornish was also responsible for putting on pageants and masques and spectaculars and writing plays and producing plays, which Henry would have staged for the benefit of important guests, ambassadors visiting royalty, and the children and gentlemen would have taken part in them, and that was very much part of Cornish's role to do that. He was a remarkable figure.
It's not easy these days in the 21st century to actually attract boys into cathedral chapel choirs. Was it easier then?
My Tudor counterparts certainly had it easier than I do in one respect, in that they had the authority of the king to go around the country and impress the best singing boys from any provincial church or cathedral choir that they heard. This was not necessarily such a bad thing as it may sound, because it would give the boys security, training, board and lodging, and often a job for life. Many of the most famous musicians in English history began life as choristers at the Chapel Royal and stayed with the organisation for their entire careers.
Well, you mentioned there, Andrew, education, board and lodging provided for the boy choristers then, and in a way that's what part of the attraction can be to being a chorister these days in cathedrals or chapel choirs.
Certainly the musical education that an organisation like this provides for the right children, for musically gifted children, it is a wonderful opportunity and they get to do many interesting things.
But no impressing?
No, alas, that has fallen into disuse.
Oh.
I enjoy the special occasions. They're really fun. You get to go to the Queen Mum's funeral, which is a really big occasion.
But look, you've got to give up all these days every week to sing in the Chapel Royal Choir. Don't you mind it?
Well, it can be very annoying.
Annoying?
Social life and friends, all friends have different things to do on Saturday nights, and then we can't because we have to wake up the next morning.
Do you sense the history about the place when you're standing up singing music of these composers who go back hundreds of years, all of whom were attached to the Chapel Royal? I mean, do you feel anything about that?
It's very difficult not to. I mean, there have been so many famous composers and musicians, for example, Sullivan, who was a head chorister of this choir, and you have that whole weight of history on your shoulders, and you're upholding the tradition. You're one in a long line.
They were once just like us, all the famous composers. I don't know what we're going to be like in later life.
Rejoice, rejoice, unto the Lord with mirth, with chants from foreign fields, preserve health in quiet state. These 8 and 20 years in quiet state, these 8 and 20 years.
James Bowman with Rejoice, Rejoice by William Byrd. James, when you sing music like that by a former member of the choir, I mean, do the hairs on the back of your head stand up?
It's certainly a wonderful experience to feel that it was written for a member of the choir. Yes, you feel quite a sense of historical perspective. And I love singing Byrd anyway.
Well, you travel the world as an international soloist. How does singing in the Chapel Royal Choir rate alongside that sort of exposure?
Well, I like it because it's the real thing. It's part of historical continuity. I love the idea of singing in a choir that's been in this chapel and the one across the road for several hundreds of years. It's a wonderful thought that one's continuing in a fantastic tradition.
So that commonly used phrase, a sense of history, really does mean something to you?
Well, it does, very much indeed. On several state occasions, you're really very conscious of it, yes.
And an example there of a piece of music composed for a very specific occasion.
Yes, and the score of that piece, In Byrd's Hand, contains the words composed for the anniversary of the accession of Queen Elizabeth I. Byrd's job as a gentleman of the Chapel Royal and later organist jointly with his friend Tallis was to direct the music in the chapel for the liturgy, but also to provide music to mark and to celebrate the events in the life of his patron and employer, Queen Elizabeth I. And that is what my job is today, to run the choir, to run music for the services, but also to provide music for events in the life of my employer, Queen Elizabeth II. Bird composed that piece for the anniversary of the accession of Queen Elizabeth, and I have recently done exactly the same thing, composed a piece jointly with the Poet Laureate Andrew Motion to mark the 50th anniversary of the accession of Queen Elizabeth II.
That's a heavy metal door. This is the safe room.
Here we have the old checkbook, the Elizabethan old checkbook. Here it is, and this contains those who comprised the Chapel Royal from 1558 onwards.
Although the evidence from the checkbook is fairly fragmentary, it is as good a picture as we could get of the daily goings-on in the Chapel Royal.
Well, certainly it is. People like Orlando Gibbons is assaulted by a yeoman of the vestry.
Not for his musical compositions.
Well, it would appear not. The gentleman concerned was eventually sacked after a series of misdemeanours, including being sick in a mess of pottage, which a number of his colleagues were eating out of at the time. But Mr. Gibbons himself is assaulted and hit round the side of the head and has his bands torn from his neck and so on. And this chap is eventually sacked from the chapel after years of misdemeanours. But also he found he couldn't go to Scotland because he had a foul disease of the groin.
So various famous musical names turn up here in unexpected places.
Well, they do. We have all these gentlemen in ordinary who subsequently find themselves recipients of news of the gunpowder plot very shortly after this was all written into this book. And so the names here read like a sort of membership list of the chapel. And here we are. We have William Byrd here, William Randall down here, John Stevens, all sorts of interesting individuals who find themselves composing.
Hearken Ye Nations by Edmund Hooper, who was the organist of the Chapel Royal in the first quarter of the 17th century. And a very interesting history to that piece. At the end of the score, in Hooper's hand, it says for November the 5th, and there are records in Westminster Abbey, where Hooper also worked, of a celebration held in the Jerusalem chamber to mark the failure of the gunpowder plot, which the king attended. And it seems certain that this piece was composed for that occasion and sung there. This day our God from foes' bloodthirsty ire hath saved us brands new taken from the fire. It's real saber-rattling stuff to celebrate the fact that Fawkes and his chums had gone to the stake. And in fact, we sang that piece for, as far as I know, the first time in modern times on November the 5th last year.
Well, there are in fact two chapels at St James's Palace, and we're now in the Queen's Chapel, where the choir are actually singing while the much older chapel is being renovated. And this reminds us, David Baldwin, that even after the English Reformation, there was a small but beautiful stronghold of Catholicism right in the heart of London.
It was very much that. From 1623 until 1688, it was the embodiment of Roman Catholicism within this country. Prince Charles marries Henrietta Maria of France. The French influence is immediate here, and we find that the King's choir master in Paris is required and ordered to produce choristers for her complement here within this chapel. And so we have a rival court, musically, just a few yards away from the old Chapel Royal.
So Prince Charles, the future Charles I, makes a foreign marriage, and this is a result of that.
That's correct, and the heritage of entering this sort of agreement whereby you have a chapel for the personal worship of the sovereign's wife was renewed almost in the same terms at the Restoration when Charles II marries Catherine of Braganza. Of course, here we hosted recent events of a really rather sad nature, with the deaths of Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, and we looked after both of those good souls here before their funerals.
Andrew Gant has brought me up a circular staircase into the Chapel Royal Choir practice room in an area, Andrew, of St James's Palace that really resonates with history.
This is the gatehouse in which Charles I spent his last night, the night before his execution. He came up here to sleep. The Archbishop of Canterbury came with him. And in the morning, he went down the very staircase that we've just come up, where our choristers' footsteps resound 4 times a week, down into the chapel to take his communion and across St James's Park to his execution in Whitehall.
So is there a ghost?
There have been reports.
Well, what happened to the Chapel Royal Choir then under Cromwell?
It ceased to function. It closed down, like music in churches across the country. Cromwell did not tolerate music in church. He was a great music lover. He enjoyed music, but just not in church. And the Queen's Chapel was actually used as a barracks and a stable during the Civil War and the interregnum. The choir was started up again at the Restoration, largely thanks to the efforts of a remarkable character called Captain Henry Cook. Cook assembled a pretty remarkable group of musicians to be his children, the Purcell brothers, Henry and Daniel, John Blow and Pelham Humphrey, to name just a few.
And this amazing new world after the Restoration, and as they say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. Henry Purcell, one of the great geniuses, becomes composer.
Yes, Henry Purcell's career is intimately bound up with this place. He became composer to the chapel, doubled his job with the job of organist at Westminster Abbey, as many people seem to do during the 17th century. And indeed, he lived in a room in this very gatehouse. So this place has a double association historically, both musically and in terms of its association with the monarchy.
Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Let your moderation be known unto
This is the Handel House Museum, the central London home of the most illustrious composer ever to have been employed by the Chapel Royal, George Frederick Handel. A German, of course, as were the 3 King Georges he served. He lived here for 36 years, and this is the room in which we know he wrote most of his music, masterpiece after masterpiece. A lovely grey panelled walls, bare floorboards, a marble fireplace, and this is a remarkably restored house just opened last year. And Handel chose to live on Brook Street, near Oxford Street here, because it was in easy walking distance of St James's Palace. And here's a copy of the sort of harpsichord which would have been in the house when Handel was here. Just a wee bit out of tune. I don't think Handel would have approved of that.
In the voice of praise and thanksgiving, among such as people needed, that voice of praise and thanksgiving, such as people needed, a voice of praise and thanksgiving, such as
Handel came to London as a young man to seek his fortune, which he made handsomely. And then after that, almost by chance, his former employer in Germany became King George I of England. And Handel re-established cordial relations with his former patron and became, firstly, a sort of unofficial royal composer, providing music for the various celebrations, and then composer to the Chapel Royal.
And of course, Handel's great moment as composer to the Chapel Royal must be considered the 1727 coronation of George II.
Well, a great moment for him as a composer, but perhaps not for the performers on that occasion. The music was famously terrible. The Dean of Westminster records that it sounded as if the different choirs had begun 2 different anthems at the same time, and the anthems were all in the wrong places. But marvellous music.
I'm standing next to a rather forbidding Victorian postbox down near the Thames on Cheyne Walk. And number 6 Cheyne Walk played a crucial role in nurturing the Chapel Royal Choir during difficult times in the 19th century. Music in many cathedrals and collegiate chapels was in a very poor state, and the pastoral care of boy choristers often left much to be desired. But that changed for the boys of the Chapel Royal when in 1854 the benefactor and music lover Thomas Helmore set up a lodging house here at number 6 Cheyne Walk, which is currently undergoing rather extensive renovation for an exclusive new resident. Well, among the choristers who benefited was none other than the young Arthur Sullivan, later to be one half of that great double act, Gilbert and Sullivan. Sullivan was attracted by the impressive red uniforms the Chapel Royal boys wore, it is said. What we do know is that he had a very, very sweet singing voice.
I don't know very many people who could write a piece of that quality at the age of 13. Some composers have difficulty writing pieces of that at the age of 30. So it is an extraordinary feat for a 13-year-old.
Thomas Helmore, the master of the children, said that Sullivan was the best boy he ever had, and people would come from far and wide to hear him sing and hand over money afterwards. That song, very much under the influence of Mendelssohn, who had been a friend of Helmore's, was composed when Sullivan was the head boy, the senior chorister of this choir, and was sung there by the present head boy, James Edwards. Sullivan was not the only man of the musical theatre to begin his career here. Some years later, Noel Coward was a probationer in the Chapel Royal Choir, although, alas, he was too easily distracted by the bright lights of London and never made it to be a chorister.
Andrew Gant, in your role as composer to the Chapels Royal, you're still continuing in this illustrious tradition of writing music to reflect important royal events, and plenty to reflect in recent times.
Yes, in the time that I've been working here, there have been 3 major events. Firstly, the 100th birthday of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and then 2 sad events this year, of course, the death of Princess Margaret and latterly the death of the Queen Mother. As you know, Her Majesty died on Easter Eve, and that evening I composed a short piece in tribute to her, which we sang at morning service on Easter Day, as part of the response of the community of which both she and we are a part. The idea of working in the same place as Cornish, Fairfax, Byrd, Tallis, Gibbons, Purcell, Handel, I find very moving and very inspiring. We dress the same, we use the same Book of Common Prayer, and to be continuing in that tradition and doing the same job that Gibbons did, that Byrd did, is a tremendous privilege.
A Good Night by the Queen's composer Andrew Gant. He was talking to Andrew Green as well as directing the choir of Her Majesty's Chapel Royal at St James's Palace. The producer was Stephen Shipley.